Hello and welcome to the very first episode of my new podcast, Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism with Jake Ryan. I'm your host, Jake Ryan, and we're going to kick off this series with an exploration of what white supremacy is and how it and other systems of oppression operate. We live in a system of white heteropatriarchal capitalism, and if you don't yet understand what that means, you definitely will by the end of this series. These systems are mutually reinforcing, meaning they work together and make each other stronger, and it's why intersectionality is that much more important. That said, their interconnectedness will help us dismantle all systems of oppression together. Pulling at the strings of misogyny, or homophobia, or classism inherently unravels the whole tapestry, so any entry point is an important attack. Together, these systems perpetuate a cultural ideal. Ultimately, a person who looks like me but is heterosexual. Those who most closely meet the cultural ideal, a cisgender, heterosexual white man who is wealthy and able-bodied, are most supported, while those least like it are least supported by the systems and, in fact, targeted by them. The US has many problems. It's an incredibly racist society, but it's even more classist. That said, even the richest and most successful people of color are still racialized. A few years ago, I read an article about how O.J. Simpson, in the height of his fame, thought that his success and wealth meant that he was able to outrun his blackness. But at the end of the day, he was still a black man, and when charged with crimes, his fame and money did not save him. After race and socioeconomic status, a person's gender identity and sexual orientation are used to evaluate them, but we'll turn to these facets of identity in a later episode. Since white supremacy plays such a big role in how people experience life in the US, let's get into it. White supremacy, like all systems of oppression, ultimately boils down to the right to space. Now, I didn't realize how political sexuality was until starting my PhD, which is in human sexuality and is sociologically focused. I learned that the US is literally set up to help white heterosexuals couple up and procreate and limit people from other races from doing the same. White people are seen as deserving of space and are encouraged to take up as much as they can, while people of color are seen as infringing on this space. In her TED Talk on DEI, Vernee Myers talks about how being included suggests it's still a white space, and they're just being nice by inviting us into it. Research has also shown that white people almost never move out of the way on a sidewalk for a person of color, indicating, again, white people's belief that they have the most right to space. Beyond that, white people are taught to think of racism as all or nothing. You either are or aren't racist, when it's really baked into how we perceive the world, or at least until we learn to critique it. On account of being a white person, I will always have some degree of racism in me, and so will you, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't actively work to dismantle this system. White people often act like it's worse to be called a racist than it is to just be racist. Obviously, at this point, most white millennials and Gen Z recognize that white supremacy is a real problem, but too many of us still fail to recognize how it shows up in our lives. So, that's what we're going to look at now. Now, how did white supremacy come to be? In 17th century Enlightenment era in Europe, science was becoming increasingly important, so some people took it upon themselves to create a taxonomy of humans. Some sought only to name the differences between different groups, or what we now call races, while others wanted to create a hierarchical ranking of the races. It must be noted that at this time, the same word was used for both race and species, which can easily lead to the dehumanization of people. Whiteness was believed to be the pinnacle of culture, and people from other cultures were generally viewed as savage or barbaric. In white people's minds, non-white people were uncultured and needed their intervention to make them better. Whiteness is centered in our society, so to white people, it's like water to a fish. To continue this analogy, it's like people of color don't have gills. But I want to be clear that they are not deficient in any way. They are just living in a society that wasn't made with them in mind. Because of its centering as a norm, most white people will fail to see white culture as being a culture at all. But whiteness requires a performance of emotional repression and rigidity. One must be proper, stick to facts, and value reason over emotion. It values rugged individualism and objectivity over personal experience. What's written in history books is prioritized over the lived experience of people of color. White supremacy also tells white people that they have a right to comfort, so they're allowed to be defensive when they feel called out, especially as it pertains to whiteness. It creates a fear of difference and retaliation, while also refusing to acknowledge slavery as white people's doing, leading to distancing from people of color. In fact, most of America is set up to help white people not have to live near or even regularly see Black people. The cost of privilege is our humanity. The lies of white supremacy are incredibly dehumanizing, and they're not as different today as they were a few hundred years ago, even though lots of white people want to believe that racism is a thing of the past. White people were able to enslave millions of Black people because they literally believed them to be subhuman. In order to believe that you're better than other people, other humans, you need to disconnect from your feelings. Feeling guilt is a natural response to dehumanizing someone. But white people have been taught to intellectualize and rationalize their feelings. When a person disconnects from their own body and experience, when emotions are processed in the brain but not felt in the body, it becomes a lot easier to treat others badly. Instead of feeling deeply guilty, white people can simply distract themselves or find justifications for maltreatment. We'll return to this in a second. I want to note that privilege is always at the expense of someone else. White people do not want to have to see Black people or be reminded that they exist because they serve as a constant reminder that our ancestors enslaved their ancestors. When slavery is brought up, or how little has changed since slavery was ended, lots of white people are eager to claim innocence. My ancestors never owned slaves, though. This behavior is another example of how white people's feelings are privileged over Black people's experiences. Slavery did happen, then formal segregation, and even still, Black people experience systemic racism, not simply isolated incidents. This typically makes white people feel overwhelmingly guilty, as it should. Our willingness to sit with guilt and discomfort is how we build empathy and create change. Not only are Black people intentionally segregated from white people, densely Black areas are generally thought of as the bad part of town. That's fucked up. It isn't Black people's fault that this society despises Blackness and that they're systemically disenfranchised. Beyond that, many white people uncritically accept the lie that Black people are innately more prone to violence and criminality, which justifies their over-policing and mass incarceration. White people have bought into the lie that Black people deserve this. White supremacy positions Black people as a threat to white people, and then locks them up and kills them to create a feeling of safety for white people. The existence of Black people is not a problem, but it is positioned as one to justify the solution of extermination. This idea of right to space empowers white people to act in certain ways. One example is how white people feel they can act as authority figures in the absence of police, who descended from slave patrols anyway and care about protecting capital, not people. Even though it's never explicitly said that white people can or should act like this, there are, unfortunately, countless instances in which they insert themselves in situations they have no business being in. Tone policing is another example, and similar to getting hung up on political correctness, it's an effort to distract from the message by focusing on how the message is delivered. Put differently, tone policing essentially boils down to how dare they make too much noise in our space. A few years ago, I showed my parents the video of Beyoncé and Kendrick Lamar performing her song Freedom at the BET Awards. I thought it was an incredible performance, and at the end of that 7-minute video, the first words out of my mom's mouth were, "I just don't understand why they have to be so angry all the time." Even when Black people aren't present, white people tend to believe they should express their frustration only in ways that white people might find palatable. This really is a no-win situation, though, because even when all Colin Kaepernick did was silently take a knee during the national anthem, white people were outraged. When confronted with unchecked racism, people of color have every right to be pissed off. Maybe it's not that black people are too extra, it's that white people are too repressed. Another behavior that white people engage in is white saviorism. When they feel inclined to help black people, white people do it with the assumption that they know what's best for others. When called out, white people can get very defensive and fall back on white guilt with excuses like, I just wanted to help, prioritizing their intent over the impact. Or they simply give up trying, which is the definition of privilege. One of the resources I've linked below is an article on imperfect allyship. It's about how you'll make mistakes and be corrected, but we shouldn't let the fear of mistakes stop us from trying to be better allies. And no, posting a black square on Instagram is not allyship. It takes a lot more than that. Now, in addition to the behaviors I just addressed, there are also behaviors that occur with malicious intent, such as lynching black people. Two well-known cases of black men and boys who were killed by civilians are Ahmaud Arbery in 2020 and Trayvon Martin in 2012. Although Ahmaud's attackers were later charged, this is rare because in a white supremacist culture, there's often no accountability for white men and no justice for black lives. In the case of Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman later sold the gun he killed him with for $250,000, adding insult to injury while highlighting how little concern our society has for black pain. When people say that the systems are broken and need to be fixed, it's important to remember that systems like white supremacy are working exactly as they should. It is designed to exalt white people and to punish, humiliate, and dismiss people of color. While of course it is important to commemorate black men who were killed by police, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw started the Say Her Name hashtag to draw attention to how rarely black women who are killed by police get any media attention or any effort toward justice. A few notable cases, names you may have heard, include Sandra Bland, whose death by hanging in police custody was ruled a suicide but left the public skeptical, Corinne Gaines, a young mother who was shot and killed by police and whose 5-year-old son was also shot but survived, and Breonna Taylor, who was murdered in the middle of the night by police under questionable pretenses. Crenshaw has said, if you say the name, you're prompted to learn the story. And if you know the story, then you have a broader sense of all the ways black bodies are made vulnerable to police violence. These women are just 3 names who did actually get national attention, but many more never do. Another example of malicious behavior involves white women's tears. Barbecue Becky and other women who call the police and play up hysteria are no different than Carolyn Bryant, the woman who lied in 1955 and got Emmett Till killed. We are past the point of giving white women the benefit of the doubt here. White supremacy literally prioritizes white feelings over black lives, and a white woman who weaponizes her tears, real or otherwise, knows, on some level, how the situation is likely to play out. This behavior is attempted murder. There are also fear-based behaviors that don't have malicious intent, but are problematic all the same. These behaviors are influenced by cultural scripts that paint black people as criminals. Examples include crossing the street when you see black people walking towards you on the sidewalk, or the compulsion to check your pockets and be sure your wallet is secure. The fact is, as a white person, I have also been subjected to these scripts, and also have to do the work of unlearning these ideas. So I'm not just sitting on a high horse and acting like I'm perfect here. That said, I've never been assaulted or even harassed by a black person. So when these fears bubble up in the presence of black people, I have to remember that the fears aren't based on my lived experience, but on the lies of white supremacy. Policing is also heavily fear-based. Because of the assumption that black people are aggressive and violent, and the fact that most police officers don't ever question their bias, they're often working in a reactive state that makes them trigger happy. When they're dealing with white people, suspects are innocent until proven guilty, while black people are guilty until proven innocent. Racial profiling is just one of many problems with policing. You look like the suspect is used as an excuse to harass and demean black people and is proof that bigots don't differentiate. I'm also reminded of a tweet I saw once that said even if you are guilty, The police aren't supposed to shoot you, but in the case of Black people, cops see themselves as able to act as judge, jury, and executioner. It is a sign of privilege to be able to believe that cops are good and on your side. There's obviously a lot more to say about this, but I'm just some white guy. I'm educated and I care, but I'll never have the lived experience of a person of color. In future episodes, we'll address other systems of oppression, but I'll draw your attention to how white supremacy still plays its part. Any challenge a person faces, whether it's misogyny, homophobia, or ableism, is going to be harder for people of color. If this podcast episode was your first foray into learning about white supremacy and how to dismantle it, thanks for being here. But please understand that your work doesn't end here. I did not end white supremacy simply by recording this, so I'm providing some great resources for you to continue your learning and unlearning in the show notes, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list. It's also not people of color's job to help you process this stuff. So don't ask your coworker, neighbor, or acquaintance who's a person of color to hold your hand or pat you on the back for doing this work. White people invented white supremacy, and people of color pay the price for it. So it's our work to do, not theirs. That said, if a person of color, author, or speaker does choose to address white supremacy, buy their book or course, but do not ask them to perform additional unpaid emotional labor. You are not owed that. That's all I got for you today. Thanks for listening, and until next time, this has been Jake Ryan with Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism.